help a little bit too, because you're going to be faced with these kinds of decisions along the way at some point when you want to actually have the money to build these new facilities or renovate your existing. So I think that's just something I wanted to mention to consider as you're thinking through it. We had some images of some of what we're talking about when we say bring something out like cosmetology to the corner and really announce it. How do we really give a sign of entry and treat things differently to bring you into the campus? So, you know, we also are thinking aesthetically about how do we address some of these concerns that you mentioned about entry, about wayfinding, about announcing what happens at the campus. So those are things we've looked at. We also looked at how do you get more out of the space you have. You know, can you cover some of the courtyards and close some of the courtyards and actually get more usable space more times during the year? So there are also ideas like that on the table that we wanted to put out there for consideration as you talk through this. Finally, I think we've mentioned sustainability before. As we look at open space, there are things to come to mind. Frankly, if you renovate all these buildings and modernize your systems, you will gain so much in terms of energy efficiency and your operating expenses. If you do that alone, you have gained, you know, you're so far down the road in terms of sustainability and energy conservation. That's going to be your biggest bang for the buck, but there are other things you can consider. As we started to phase this, we really tried to understand from you what the priorities were. And listed on the left are some of the things we understood. Well, there are projects in process. We know you've renovated, or just about done, or ready to move into the Beginner's Inn. We know there's a project that WLC is working on to renovate this building. And we know that you've got a project out here to do a new field house and rehab your fields. So one of the first goals in anything we're doing here is not to jeopardize those projects that are already in the state funding queue. Even if state funding is delayed and you can't get your hands on the money, we really wanted to make sure that anything we did does not jeopardize those projects and doesn't do anything to kick them out of their space in the funding queue. The next thing is we know that, you know, the theater I think has gotten bumped a couple of times in terms of getting its renovation going. So we recognize that that's really a priority because it's been long-standing. We also know that you've got a library learning resource center underway because it was a priority, and it's clear from the programmatic space needs that you were undersized and needed to expand that as soon as you could. So that's already in the state queue and approved for funding as well. And then we also heard priorities for sciences. Now, one of the things I want to mention, we're recommending a new facility. This is not just because something in the educational master plan says so. It doesn't. It just says, and we just see that your spaces don't respond to teaching science in modern times. And so when we looked at your campus though, the type of construction you have and the way the campus, this is almost acting like one big building, not a bunch of individual buildings. So it makes it very difficult to pull one out of the middle or do something substantial. And particularly when you renovate for science, a concrete structure is rather unforgiving to renovate and do all the things you need to do to put in ventilation and systems and fans and whatnot to support that facility. So we really felt that we needed to recommend a new facility and chose a location that we felt with the library would help form this new gateway and strengthen the entry on this side of the campus, which is kind of a back door right now. So that was another priority that we understood. Establishing a one-stop student services center, you know, this has really become a trend, not only at community colleges, but at all universities, that, you know, really sort of, you know, welcoming the new student, giving them one place to go, giving your current students one place to go for all of their business needs, for their counseling needs. So we recognize that as a priority as well. And then, again, responding to the centers that you do define. They may be different than what we're hearing today, but again, finding a way to respond to whatever you do define. And then finally, any other priorities you've identified in these meetings. So in the short term, our focus is really addressing the projects that are underway. These projects you already know about, that already are in design or ready to be constructed or have been constructed, they're still there, they're still going on, they're still following their current schedule. Then we, again, put the theater as a priority in the first phase. You still have bond money. You still have some money to spend. So we're suggesting that maybe the theater actually gets some of that money now. It was in the queue for state funding, so we initially had it further back in the pack, but when we heard from you guys how long you've been waiting for that, you know, we suggested, well, here's an idea. You know, if you don't need the state funding, we don't have to put it in the second or third phase. maybe you could bring it forward. So we've put it in for you to consider, and consider different ways of funding it. The Consolidated Construction Technology programs, again, yes, that's dependent on if you move something out that you can get some more things in one place, great. If not, at minimum, that outdoor covering, not very good, not in very good shape, really needs to be seismically retrofit, really needs some improvement. You need some storage for that program so it's not just sitting outside under that overhang, under that awning. So again, even if it's not something that is a result of moving programs out, from a simple facility standpoint, it's a priority to address that area and make sure that it's safe, that it's organized, that you have the space you need in that area. We did talk about cosmetology. You know, whether or not you might have stated it strongly in your educational program or not, it was mentioned, and in conjunction with how do we sort of also advertise what happens at the campus is a perfect opportunity. We might have liked to suggest, oops, sorry. Oh, I'm jumping ahead, you can't see that already. Whether or not, you know, we might have suggested also culinary would be a perfect candidate to be kind of street front and center, but you already have a project that you're done with. There's, you know, it doesn't make any sense for us to suggest to move it. And it has some nice adjacency to the estuary, and will give you, I think, a really rich facility back there. So when things like that give us opportunities, we have made suggestions that might help enhance some of your programs that we could see being a beacon to the public. And then finally, you know, these last two items, you know, as you do some of these projects that might gain you some street front presence, you know, go ahead and see if you can't work in a project around the same time, you know, to do whatever you need to kind of spruce up Fallon Street, address how that street front looks, how people access it. And of course, every time you do some phased projects, you're going to have to relook at parking, you're going to have to relook at other infrastructure support. Can your central plant take it? When do you need to modify your central plant to take on new loads, new buildings, new renovations? The midterm, kind of that middle 5 years, again, at that point in time, the state funding will be coming through, the library will get constructed. We know already, again, in the state queue is the modernization of the gym and locker rooms. That's about where it's positioned in the state funding list right now, so that's in the second term. And then this is where we start to get into our suggestion for a new science building. And, you know, several steps would have to go hand in hand. They'd have to be orchestrated with programs moving to swing space, to other locations, to being reduced, consolidated, whatever the case may be, in order to free up a building site. So these kinds of things are some of the biggest things you'll have to talk about. But this, to us, was one of the best locations to suggest a new science building because of kind of the synergy of two new buildings down here on this edge of the campus, really activating, you know, the view, the presence from this street and an entryway from there, and giving you the chance to build a facility that will serve your needs rather than one that's adapted and always compromised trying to fit into one of your existing buildings. But what this might mean is that, you know, this might be a new candidate for state funding and you'll need more time, but we also wanted to be sensitive to the fact that the spaces that sciences are in right now, we can see are in dire need of being modernized. And so we also didn't want to put the science building too far down in the queue, like in the end of the third phase, where, you know, you'd be waiting so long. So we're trying to also balance that a little bit. And then finally, again, addressing infrastructure. Here's where you would, if you did these projects and they're finishing up in the midterm, you'd want to make sure you're starting to do that narrowing of the street and really addressing the crossings and the treatment of these entrances, landscaping around this side of the campus as well. And then finally, in the long term, to kind of bring you full-scale finish, you could go ahead then and renovate Building A for Student Services. You don't really have to consider losing that chunk of space until about that time, as everything's been constructed and you've added the space. Then in the third phase, if you're still sitting with the same ratios that Moss has defined right now, you will need to start considering some balancing at this point. But in the meantime, we are still showing photography moving from Building A to Building B so that you kind of have all the visual arts, you know, graphic arts, photography, and all of the arts in a new art building, kind of in the same quadrant of the campus. I know this is one of those suggestions that's been made for potential efficiencies and consolidation, but you may still be retaining photography. There's space for it. We wanted to make sure there was a little bit of flexibility that you could really play with this.